Hello and welcome to the Finance Quarter. I'm Andrew Robertson. On the program today, to buy or not to buy. The great Australian dream is to own our own home, but is it really the best way to spend our money? And Gail Kelly's advice to other aspiring career women: don't let work rule your life. But first today, the second part of our look at credit card fraud. In our last program, Deloitte risk partner Tommy Viljoen examined how individuals can protect themselves against the shysters. Today he turns the spotlight on small business.
For small business, there's probably the credit card side when a payment is not honoured, but also what happens if they're involved in one of these attacks. And I think that's probably an area where I've seen some organisations really suffer. This is where, for example, they've stored the credit card details, they've been hacked, and suddenly they find themselves part of a headline in a newspaper. And that's a crying shame because their reputations are damaged. We've just seen an organisation go under, an IT organisation, because they were hacked and they've had to sell out, basically. They couldn't survive.
Because they have no access to their customers?
Well, for this particular IT organisation, they were looking after the websites of a number of different customers, and they were hacked. And so, which customer is going to want to go back to them and use their facilities? But we've seen online organisations that have been hacked, and they were providing services, and their customer numbers have dropped radically because people don't feel safe anymore. So the ability to protect yourself as a small business is crucial, and there's a lot of there's steps you can take to protect yourself.
Well, just on that, small business doesn't have the resources of a big organisation, so what can small business do?
Well, small business, the first thing they can do is ensure they don't take credit card details. Don't store those details, because if you're storing those details, you're putting yourself in a vulnerable situation. So go to a payment gateway and set yourself up in a way that a customer can provide their card details. It's actually going to the payment gateway, and they have much stronger security, and that way you don't store the card. Most small businesses store card details because if they have to make a refund, then they've got the information. If that's your situation, take the mobile phone number or contact details of the customer, and if you need to make a refund, get the card details only when you need the refund, and then destroy them afterwards.
Is there anything else small business can do?
Well, small business can also sign up to some of the security features that I talked about with banks, such that when a customer is an online customer, they can verify that the customer is who they say they are, and it verifies both the customer and it verifies the merchant through the bank. And it's a great facility, and all the banks have these facilities. So speak to your bank manager and ask for these authentication mechanisms that are available today.
It sounds from what you've been saying that this is a much bigger issue for small business than it is for individual consumers.
Well, I think the individual consumer, there's more protection in that the banks will help with refunding. That is obviously not available to the small business. We're starting to see in the US and some of the other countries the emergence of insurance against crime and computer hacking. The market is not yet as developed in Australia, so there isn't the level of protection for the small business as there is elsewhere.
Well, Tommy Viljoen, you've given us a lot to think about today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Corporate Australia, it seems, is at last taking women seriously. Most enlightened companies now have reasonably ambitious targets for getting women into senior management. But according to one woman who smashed the glass ceiling a long time ago, increased opportunities bring increased risks. Westpac boss Gail Kelly says it's important that women climbing the corporate ladder don't let work take over their lives. Gail Kelly knows all about juggling work and family. At one point in her life, she had 4 children under 4 and a senior management job in a South African bank.
There's a big blur element for me about those years, because it's just exhaustion.
Addressing an audience of women from the banking and finance industry in Sydney, Mrs. Kelly admitted that in those early years she struggled to get her priorities right as work dominated her life.
You're working so jolly hard, you feel like you're dropping balls, you feel like you can't cope. You go home and you feel just overwhelmed, and you've still got the washing to do and the cooking to do and worrying about kids' homework, and you think, what is all this about? So in that kind of mode, And I'd find then it was my family that would suffer, actually.
The Westpac boss says eventually she rethought her life and realised that work needed to be kept in perspective.
The big rocks in your life, put them in first. Your children, your relationships, your home, your passions, your health. Put them in first and pay attention to them. Pay attention to them. And then all of the rest will give you a happy and healthy and whole life.
Afterwards, Mrs. Kelly elaborated, saying it's not worth getting to the top at any price for either women or men.
A lot of people really battle to get that balance right and really sometimes finish their careers and they've lost something along the way and they regret that. And the most important thing really, I think, the area you can make the most contribution and difference is to make sure that you have sound, solid, happy relationships and that you're paying attention to those big rocks that only you can do.
Mrs. Kelly says women with children need strong support from their husband or partner as they make their way in the world of business, and she believes women need to support themselves by taking the opportunities that are presented to them. She says that's something men are much better at. In our last program, we discussed superannuation with financial planner Damien Cullen, and one of the downsides of super is that your money is tied up till you're at least 55, which means if you put too much into super at a young age, it could make buying a house a lot harder. And that got me thinking, do you really need to buy a house? Well, Damien Cullen has kindly agreed to offer his insights again. Damien, the vast majority of Australians aspire to own their own home, but in purely financial terms, is that the best use of your money?
Oh, look, I think it depends on the stage of your life, Andrew. I think when you're young and you've just left school, then probably building up an investment portfolio would be a better way to go, with a view to saving the deposit and then eventually getting a house. I think it's owning a house is a fantastic thing that you should be aspiring to eventually, but it's more of probably at the family stage of your life that it's important.
There are some people who argue, as you just alluded to, that when you're young you should start investing in high growth assets and then keep investing in them, and you'll earn a much higher return than if you just buy a house.
Look, that's something that may be the case. I don't aspire to the fact that you have to do one or the other. I think there's the opportunity to build up an investment portfolio, use that to acquire a house, and then as you pay down the house, you can use the equity in the house to build up investments as well. So you can do both, and that's probably going to work out better than doing one or the other.
Now, when we last met in our last program, we were talking about a child who probably have an enormous amount of money in superannuation when she stops working. Should she buy a house?
Ideally, yeah. Obviously, it's impossible to use that money in super for the house, but I think having a home, particularly when you get to the stage of having children, is something that's really important. I think it's a cornerstone for creating financial wealth. So aspiring to get that home and getting it at that point in your life when you want stability and you want to know that a landlord can't sell your property or change their mind or put the rent up too high, it provides comfort and stability that you just can't get if you're renting.
Notwithstanding that, if you have lots and lots of money, is there any real need to buy a house?
I think so, yeah. I think it does provide that comfort factor that people like. It's not just a financial decision. It's a good financial decision. It may not necessarily be the very best financial decision, but the reason that we want finances is so that we can live the lives that we want. And I think owning a house provides a very important part of the human psyche with what it needs.
So what you're saying is when you're talking about your own house, it's not purely a financial decision, there are qualitative issues as well.
Oh, absolutely. I think Bunty Will put it very well in The Castle when he said you can buy a house but you can't buy a home.
And I guess one of the long-term issues is, where are you actually going to live when you stop working?
A lot of people aspire to the sea change philosophy. I think that's a dangerous thing to do when you get to retirement. I think if you've got a home, chances are you've built up a lot of friends and a lot of community support in that area. So chances are you probably want to be staying fairly close to that area. The house that you had with your family in may not necessarily be the appropriate house to stay in retirement, but generally that area is where you've got a lot of support networks and a lot of families. So moving away from that area is not ideal.
You touched on something earlier when you said that if you buy a house, you can then use that as security to borrow to invest. And although a lot of young people might think, well, I'll just invest now, what I hear you say is if you own your own house, you could actually make more.
Yeah, once you've got the house and you've got some equity in the house, there's no reason why you can't borrow money back against that house. It's quite tax effective to do that, and then you can use that to invest in higher performing assets like the share market.
Damien, a lot to think about there. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.
Now, if you do decide to buy a house, the next few years could be a good time to get into the market. That's because the currently overinflated house prices are tipped to substantially fall. The big unknown, of course, is by how much. Controversial Sydney academic Professor Steve Keen thinks they'll plummet by 40% and take the economy with them.
America was in an absolute boom until after the house prices crashed for exactly the same reason we've been in one now. What you've got caught up in is what I call a Ponzi economy, where speculation on rising asset prices actually drives overall economic activity. When the speculation ends, and it has to at some point, then you have a crash. When that level of debt spending falls, the economy goes down with it.
Well, on that last point, you'd have to say Professor Keen is being proved right as we consumers rein in our spending. But will house prices fall 40%? Property developer Dr. Tony Hayek was speaking at the same conference as Professor Keen, and he believes on housing the professor's views are extreme.
Steve Keen is a very intelligent man, and he's an economist, and I think he has a fundamental misunderstanding of how the property market works and how the Australian people view the property market. The only way that prices can fall significantly is if we have the Australian people deciding all at the same time, or a major portion of them all at the same time, to sell their property. Now, Australians are more likely to sell their children before their home.
Moving away from housing now, and amid all the kerfuffle over the federal government's proposed carbon tax, you might be forgiven for thinking that everybody is against it. But that's not the case. Environmental architect Caroline Pidcock has just returned from touring Europe and the parts of the United States where a price on carbon already exists. And she says the benefits for business and the environment are already being seen.
In those places, the regulation has given a certainty to the market moving forward, so that has allowed really good window manufacturers to kit up to produce good windows, really good insulation options. A whole lot of those things that help make those houses perform a lot better have been given the certainty to do their work and to change how they do things. And now those things are a whole lot less expensive than single glazing and other less efficient building technologies.
Well, that's it for this edition of the Finance Quarter. If you'd like to see any part of the program again, you can find us on the ABC News website. Just go to the business page and click on the Finance Quarter icon. And if you have any questions about money or business, we'd love to hear from you. Our email address is thefinancequarter@your.abc.net.au. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on the Finance Quarter.